I'm Professor Steve Finnegan, also from LCAPS and School of Justice Studies. I just wanted to say initially, before questions, how interesting that was. Some of the older faces in the audience, ex-cops, will well remember the early 2000s with the Reassurance Project and the development of neighbourhood policing, which you were at the heart of. But of course, you've taken us much further back to 1829 to look at some of the standards and the values that were espoused at that time. And now, of course, you've highlighted some of the real challenges around trust and confidence, and you've touched on reform will be necessary. We might see whether some people would push you a little around what type of reform you think might be necessary over coffee, because you mentioned governance as well. We certainly talked about the role of police and crime commissioners. And as I say, Gavin is happy to take questions on anything related to the lecture that was just delivered. So let's go over to the audience. And Adrian, I think.
Thank you very much, Adrian James. I'm starting. I hope this doesn't feel like I'm trying to put you on the spot. And some of the reforms you're talking about, or you prefer necessary in terms of governance and joint working, really succeeded once there are 43 police forces in England and Wales.
I think it's harder on a model of 43. So when I spoke about the tiering of capabilities, I think in the modern world that we live in, we know that there are many things, combating deep fakes and how to respond in an agile way to misinformation and disinformation so that disorder doesn't grow, for example. That there aren't 43 different answers to that question. There may be 1, 2 or 3 that need to be developed collectively and together. And even though I sense in my 2 years chairing council that there is a movement of colleagues to recognise that more collective action is needed, the model is just not set up well to enable that. It's not quick enough or agile enough to do so. The money's not in the right places. We have to sort of negotiate it in every time we want to do something. So we do need to decide, what do we want to do nationally, what do we want to do regionally, and what do we want to do locally? As I touched on, many other jurisdictions around the world in addressing that question have said, well, do we need 3 tiers? Or is it a national and a local tier? The local tier being big enough to be resilient and have a set of capabilities that will get them through most problems. My personal view is that I think the days of the 43 are limited, not least by financial resilience, but also by the need to have those strong capabilities. So if it was my decision, I'd go, I don't know, 9 or 10 big, strong regions, strong national entities. Interestingly, I was talking to my counterpart in the Netherlands. I know it's quite loud, isn't it? I'll move that down a bit. My counterpart in the Netherlands a couple of weeks ago, the Netherlands went from 100 and something police forces in the 90s down to 30 something, and then in 2014 went down to I think 9 or 10 with 1 national commissioner in the. Well, there was 2 central bodies. They're now thinking about doing 1, and they describe now being able to govern the policing of the Netherlands with a board of 16 people. That's wholly different than trying to do it with a council of 60. So that's where my thoughts are on it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Yeah.
I'm trying to put football back into the analogy.
Okay.
When I was growing up as a lad in the late 60s and early 70s, I think policing was like being a referee at a rugby match. I think policing nowadays is like being a referee at a football match. You're getting shouted, screamed at by players, by the people, on the touchlines, the coaches, by the supporters, and then a bigger, broader community who lives, online. And I think a lot of that has come through technological advancement and societal change that has been so remarkably quick. That it really sort of overpowers. And if I bring the academic space in. You know, academic space is now concerned about technology, generative AI, etc., etc., etc. So where are the technological opportunities for policing in the next 5 or 10 years, rather than framing it as a negative?
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas about possibilities?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there are 3 categories on which we're doing our thinking about emerging new technologies and where they help. So number one, what are the technologies that can just replace those volumetric tasks that no longer need to be done by officers and staff colleagues, quite frankly, which they find enormously frustrating and time consuming. And in our wellbeing surveys, they will describe them as stresses that just making their day-to-day life more difficult. And many of those, I think there's a real opportunity to sort of engineer them out. There's a second set of technologies that will allow them to catch more criminals and put more people before the courts and reduce more disorder. And of course, right at the forefront of that prominence at the moment is the facial recognition developments, for example. But equally, we had a brilliant talk in the office from a DI on the Trident sort of gangs and guns unit earlier in the week, who was talking about some of the things that they're doing on online marketplace for selling firearms, for example. Technologies that'll get us to the evidence of what's needed to get the case before the court more quickly, decisively, and often with overwhelming evidence that people can't argue with. And then the third, and this is perhaps the most interesting, what are the technologies that help us keep pace and get ahead of criminality? So in particular, how are they exploiting tools like AI to commit fraud and so on? But what are we doing to leapfrog ahead? And if I've got a fear in that, it's about cyber resilience. If there's one thing coming into this role that is a much bigger problem than I saw it as when I was a chief in a county force, it's the cyber resilience threat. And of course, this week we're seeing it in the retail sector. There is absolutely no reason why that couldn't happen in the policing sector. Another driver, by the way, for a strong national centre that's fixing that once and for everybody.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. Yeah, just at the back. Thanks, Elizabeth.
I'm allowed 2 questions. So one is, Gav, defining theme very much about love.
Yeah.
What's it going to take for the UK government to love and show love to UK policing? And if I am allowed a second, I'd just be interested to know whether you think that the job of Chief Constable is now too difficult to do. And perhaps, if I may, invite Steve to just make a remark or 2 about that as well.
Yeah, I'll start with the second then. No, it's definitely doable if you love it, but you've got to have a lot of love for it because it comes with a lot of pressures now. If you look at the wellbeing survey work from the National Staff Association, they will describe that pressure as was covered in the last question. The volume and range of scrutiny and commentary about your actions. We were talking before we started this evening about a colleague that was called out in media in the last couple of weeks for the actions they were taking around the police race action plan. And it takes a brave chief to take a deep breath, let it pass over, to basically do what Rowan and Maine were recommending, not interfere idly, let the storm pass because the well-disposed bystander is not going to be swayed by it. But that takes some strength of character, and it absolutely takes its toll. It's taken its toll, especially on female chief constables at the moment, who can often find themselves at the centre of all sorts of online hatred and vitriol, and we do need to find a way to deal with that more effectively. So the second pressure they describe is the political governance relationship that currently exists, and I think that's another pillar of the reform that we need to do. In terms of love with the current government, maybe behind the scenes that they do love it, but they do love us, but they don't say it enough publicly. I think there's one thing that will give them more confidence to be more public about their appreciation for chiefs and for policing. And that's if we deliver on the neighbourhood policing promise. It's definitely my firm belief that if we do that well, our communities will notice the difference. There's been some great coverage of say the work that Steve's doing in Greater Manchester in retaking control of the I forget the name of the neighbourhood, but where there's all the sort of counterfeit shops had taken over and all that sort of stuff. The in control bit. I think if we do that well, it may well give our political leaders the confidence to do some of the other things that we're asking for. So I think that's part of the deal.
I'll not take up much of Gavin's time, but yeah, the role of the Chief Constable is very difficult, and I think it's getting increasingly difficult. Gavin has touched on governance. We did have a conversation along with John and Andy earlier where we talked about the introduction of police and crime commissioners in 2012. I suppose I was one of those lucky Chief Constables in that I had a good relationship with my PCC. We fell out occasionally, but we knew where the lines were, operational independence and direction and control. It's a very different operating environment than it was when a number of us became Chief Constables, when you had police authorities, 17 individuals that you would go before every month and they would hold you to account. It's very different now.
Nobody's followed the reasonable line of inquiry yet. You'd get in trouble for that.
So we've got a
I don't need a microphone. I would normally go down the deep fake line because that's what my research team do.
Yeah.
We're going to go differently. The story you told about your colleagues doing the flowers.
Yeah.
If I can call it the Dixon of Dock Green, friendly copper. You want policing with permission from those public.
Yeah.
Those stories are great. How are you going to fight the fact that if you have one even bruised apple in the pot, that video is now all over Facebook in seconds?
Yeah.
Where, for that family, there might be 20, 30 people, if you ignore what you've told us, who would know about it.
Yeah. The impact of poor police behaviour and police conduct, and the way that was described by Rowan and Main, the corrosive effect of it, they saw it then. Of course, the corrosive, and interestingly, if you've ever heard Lawrence Sherman do his bit about the early days of the Met, about how many people they sacked in the early years, it's eye-watering. Not many people survived the initial recruitment process because they were trying to find the right people. The standards that were expected in policing were not universal standards across the populace, which is why we've got to really guard against our standards and behaviour. And of course now, as you've described, one intemperate moment can be known by so many more people. I'll turn to Martin's signal crimes work, and what we learned through that as well is that you can also have signal victories. So maybe like I was saying earlier on, Steve's work in GMP with the counterfeit stuff is a signal victory. We have just got to have many more signal victories than we've had in recent time, or been confident to broadcast. And that again, back to Rowan and Main, not to interfere idly, but when to do so boldly and with confidence. We've got to re-find our confidence about communicating those signal victories when we get it right.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. Any more questions, folks?
Gavin, I'd just like to ask you your views on the appropriateness and the effectiveness of current recruitment to chief officers. You talk about sort of momentary lapses of temper being intemperate, and I think the public understand that and they get it. What they don't get are sex pests as chief constables, people wearing medals they're not entitled to.
Yeah.
And there doesn't seem to be a month goes by where the chief officer is not in trouble for something.
Yeah.
I think we've already had Steve allude to police and crime commissioners.
Yeah.
We clearly have the ability to select almost unilaterally chief officers. I just wonder what your views are for the future, because it's not looking very bright at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, there have been too many examples at chief officer rank that send a terrible message to others, aren't they? And I'm speculating here, but I do wonder whether the broader political climate, as described by Moises Naim in his book about the post-truth world, where we see some of this behaviour in some of our very public figure leaders, that somehow our message filters down that this is okay and you can get away with it. And as of course, as Ronan Main and Reith summarised, in policing you can't, because the whole success of the project is judged on the conduct of the constable, and as chiefs we're constables, and we send an even stronger message about the standards and the culture. I do not profess to know what has driven all of these individual acts and how people get themselves into a position where that happens, but what we do recognise is the impact of it. For balance, though, I would also say that we recognise that there have been colleagues whose reputation and name has been strongly and severely tarnished by public exposure, unfairly and unnecessarily, by poor decision making by some of those police and crime commissioners. That is also damaging because it undermines the confidence of colleagues to step forward to come for those positions. So the balance is wrong. We not as part of the police reform pillars that I talked about, but there is reform of the sort of accountability structure at the moment, and one of the things that needs to change in there are the thresholds as to when something is necessary for investigation and when something is necessary for action. There's a willingness across a range of leaders to resolve that. I think if we can, maybe we can claim back some of the territory that we've lost in recent years.
Yep, we have another question.
Yeah. So following from what you've said, I answer my question. Do you think the police could learn from teachers, where there's the Teacher Regulation Authority who are banning teachers daily, but you don't hear the same about police? And some of the, from all levels, some of the things that they've done, you think, oh my God, why aren't they getting dealt with? So, do you think you could learn from that? Where, for example, a teacher can't even be convicted of drunk driving without losing their job. But there are coppers with speeding points that are still in the motorway unit or.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to keep some balance and get the thresholds right. I mean, I don't think any of us would put forward a position that there can't be people in policing who've made mistakes in the past, have learned from them and moved on. There is an opportunity to rehabilitate. I know of plenty of colleagues who were wonderful colleagues with the sort of higher standards of integrity and behaviour now, but did things in their youth that they regret that they did. So I don't think we should be puritanical about this. But we should be clear on our standards. The one thing that I find attractive about the licence to practice idea, particularly when you look in the medical world, is that in the setting of the licence to practice, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, if the colleagues in the room will know better than this, I think every 5 years they refresh what's in the licence based on public consultation. So they get a view from the public as to what they think are important. Not just in terms of professional competence, but in terms of expected behaviour and conduct, and that's reflected in the licence. And I think there's great value in getting that public perspective, because when I was talking earlier about keeping pace with societal norms, it's when we get out a step, I think, that you can have real problems. And then just to the specific point about banning people, there's plenty of cops getting sacked and going on the barred register. Sadly, it's 593. Serena's given me the figure, and maybe it's just because I'm tuned into police media, but I read about plenty of those in the police media. I don't necessarily see much about teaching, but maybe that's just the different media we're consuming.
Okay, we've got a question here. Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you, Gavin. I've learned so much from your lecture. Appreciate that. So this is I'm a PGR, a researcher from engineering department. So my question is about the crimes or protests involved by the mass. So after Southport, and even before Southport, we observed the UK, there are here and there a lot of protests, street protests. Some are involved by the rhetoric behind, like religious affair, and also some ethnicity involved. In that case, do you have any plan before, like scenario planning, how to intervene, when to intervene?
Mm-hmm.
How do you position the forces like proportionate to the mass? Like that. Sometimes street protesters become hooligan. You know?
Mm-hmm.
They become rioters. So in that case, what is the tipping point, or what is the threshold that you consider to deploy forces,
Mm-hmm.
to arrest, something like that? Sometimes this is very thin margin.
Yeah. So the policing of protest and public order in today's world, I think, is one of the most challenging aspects of policing that happens. Sir Andy's predecessor, Tom Windsor, referred to it as the brain surgery of policing. That these things are incredibly nuanced, not just in their planning, but in their execution of those plans on the day. And we require a great deal from those individual colleagues that might be at that seat of emerging disorder in amongst a wider protest, and those judgments are very difficult. Post-event in public media, we then often see a segment of something that's happened out of context, and a bit like we were saying earlier, that spreads far and wide, and how do you get the sort of counter-narrative to be equally strong so people can see the full detail of the truth. And of course, now we also have great technology and opportunity to do identification when it's not safe to act at the time, to be able to get people later. Now, I am not a public order specialist. That's not something I've spent my career pursuing, but I do appreciate from talking to the commanders that are doing this week in, week out in places like London, that those judgment calls are very difficult. I mean, again, back to the words of Rowan in Maine, choosing who to intervene on, who to take out, and who to disperse. That's one of the reasons that where policing discretion needs to come to its fore, and there are always going to be people that disagree with those positions. So, and in the early weeks of the protests in London after the Hamas attacks on Israel, we all saw play out publicly what the Home Secretary's views were. In comparison to the Commissioner of the Met. I sat in on some of those discussions where we were talking about the balance, and that's another reason why the operational independence of policing needs to remain strong. Because if you want us to be accountable, we need to be independent. If we get those decisions wrong, we're accountable for those decisions. But if somebody else is reaching in and saying this is how it should happen, then they become accountable for those decisions. And I would suggest that's not a great place to be. The final thing I'd say on it is that we need to give a great deal of leadership support to those colleagues that do those difficult roles, because some of those judgment calls are extraordinarily difficult.
Can I have another question
sure.
quickly? So we all are shocked by the Netflix series, which is known as Adolescent, so which is released recently.
Yeah.
Which is about the adolescent crime, and also cyber crimes, and also the use of screen, and also screen edit, and also games, online gaming, etc. So what is your insight or also outlook in the UK in the future? That would be a real problem, and how would you tackle such kind of condition from the policing point of view? Yeah,
it's one of the things that worries me the most about the future is what's happening to our children and young people by the consumption of such content. And in the Netflix documentary Adolescence, of course, we saw the impact that these influences are having on young men in particular, and their violent attitudes that can emerge towards women. I read a National Crime Agency briefing recently about the most extreme ends of that type of activity, and it is extraordinarily concerning. I think it's important to recognise that in policing we definitely can't solve this on our own. But back to the message about in control, where we can exercise control and send a very strong message through really high quality investigations and strong prosecutions, it's really important. It's really important to do so. I said recently in an interview, we also need to see that strength coming from Ofcom in the new online harms legislation that they've got available, to make the providers of some of these platforms also recognise the harm and impact that it's having on children and young people. Ultimately, I think the progress will come through an educational challenge. We have to help our young people through that family upbringing, through that community upbringing, to recognise the dangers that they are potentially exposed to. But there are some practical ideas being discussed in the same way that we now have for games and films, age-related content, and so on. We're going to have to be much more robust in those sort of controls. And of course, we've seen in Australia that they're doing restriction applications up to a certain age now. Whether that would be successful, it'd be interesting to watch what other jurisdictions are doing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Gavin. Yep. Thank you.
We're expecting to see an increasing community sentencing to really pressure on prisons.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that as being something that's going to hinder in the short term community-enabled policing, even if in the medium term it's expected to reduce reoffending?
So I agree that when done well, and I've got experience of this from leading a force, particularly with children and young people, female offenders, care leavers, military veterans, keeping people that don't need to be in custody out of custody, with good community reparation activities, with good rehabilitation activities, which needs good local service provision. It can't just be nothing. That can definitely have a positive impact. In the short term, I think you're right to identify that if we have another wave of prison releases, then that needs to come with some element of control, whether that's through more enhanced electronic monitoring, whether it's through strengthening probation service activities. It's going to need investment. And the line that I've been taking when I've been discussing this with ministers and senior officials is just because it's out of prison doesn't mean it's out of justice. And there's a role for the justice system to still do what the justice system needs to do to keep some control, in the same way I've been talking about policing control tonight, because this can't all just flow to us. But I agree with the proposal that if done well in the medium term, it can definitely have a crime reduction effect.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. Yep, we have one on the left.
Thanks for your talk, and I found it marvellous. Colin Robinson, I've been working with the Merseyside team and CCTV for about 5 years. And I find it interesting, the love that they have for their job and how much they care.
Yeah.
What we're not getting, which I really don't understand, is the way the media, the mainstream media, I'm calling them now, not necessarily the social media, always seem to pick on the worst things.
Yeah.
I was wondering how your views on that and how that can be managed and improved. Because what I'm saying is completely the opposite.
Yeah.
People completely care about their job.
Yeah. It's all about the cash, isn't it? It's all about money. They basically need people to click on things to generate money. And I think as we've learned, through how this technology is that is emerged, that the human nature is that we're motivated by shock and outrage to click on things more than we are on stories about my mate Andy or tribute to my mate Glenn. It just gets, unless it's dogs and horses, as policing has found sometimes to its problem. The media are generating shock and outrage, a bit like Moises Naim says in his book, and for some reason it's our human nature to engage with that. I don't think, and this is not a defeatist view, that in policing alone we're necessarily going to be able to change the narrative that media, whether it's mainstream or local, can, social, can tell the story about us. I think we have to find much more effective ways using some of these same technologies, developed really well for precision targeting of communities, and some forces are doing this brilliantly on Facebook. Their signal victories, getting them to the right audiences in the right places, so people are seeing them. And we know when that's done well, that those communities will then have a very different view of their local policing teams, and we see that in the stats, incidentally. So even though the national stats about confidence in policing, trust in policing as an institution, clearly are on the decline. Often, where done well, the confidence in their local policing team, when you ask them that question, can be resiliently high. And some of it's because they're getting that human connection, and they're also getting on their Facebook feed that their local team did this round the corner from them last night. I think that's the answer, rather than trying to think about how we solve the media, because that's just a massive money question, I think.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. Right, I was going to say one last question, and you can have it.
Thanks, Steve. I'll speak up. Hopefully people can hear me. So thanks, Gavin, for the presentation. Oh,
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, so I was really taken by, as an organisational leader, you talked about meeting those people starting out in their policing career, like the exercise that you did, and you got people thinking about their sort of claims and their negotiations of belonging. And I was just picking up two questions related to that about those people who are coming into the service. I mean, the first one is, as you're meeting people coming into the service, when you got us to do that exercise about where we felt safe, where we felt we belonged, and you posed the question about how can policing facilitate people feeling more safe, I guess, are you seeing that people coming into policing have that emotional intelligence to understand that policing can also be a way of not belonging and making people feel unsafe? And that their claims of safety and belonging, claims of security are somewhat ineligible. So there's that piece about emotional intelligence. And then the other dimension of belonging that I guess I'm interested in is, as you're finding these people coming into the service, you talked about your own history with policing. It's given you a great sense of identity and belonging in service, and the values that it represents for you and people that you've worked with. Are those people who are coming into policing now, are they looking for that sense of organisational belonging? And do you feel that they are going to have that same sense of organisational belonging that you've had in an era where we're talking about portfolio careers, moving around? So it's those two different dimensions of belonging.
I'm extraordinarily optimistic about colleagues that are coming into to policing. And let's not forget, during the years of the pandemic, we recruited 47,000 new colleagues into policing during those pandemic years, but 250,000 people applied to join policing. 250,000. So there's a huge body public out there who still maintain a very strong interest in wanting to serve their community, and I take sort of great hope from that. My experience of meeting so many new recruits, and I know whether the team here feel the same, is that they are sort of brimming with energy and pride and passion in the same way that I was when I joined. So I do still see those same motivations. There are some worries for me in that though as well though. Back to the leadership of the Race Action Plan. Black colleagues or colleagues from other minority communities still tell us that they're having a really tough time in policing. When we look at attrition, there are still disparity rates in that. When we look at their inclusion in the conduct system. You know, they're being disproportionately taken in the conduct system, which really undermines their sort of sense of belonging in the organisation. So by no means is everybody getting that sense. I have a strong belief that the principles of neighbourhood policing that we talked about doing with the community, you can also do that inside the organisation. In fact, the research tells you that it does have a bearing. So we did a Government Office for Science commission through our Chief Scientific Advisor, Paul Taylor, about the drivers of confidence. And no surprises, all of the evidence about neighbourhood policing comes back, understanding community problems. But in the evidence base, what they also found was about the importance of internal advocacy. And that if colleagues feel that they've got a voice in their organisation, some influence over their day-to-day work and the direction of their team, unit, department, or the force, then that plays ultimately externally to what the public feel about the organisation. So we've got to work hard on both fronts. Specifically, the point of emotional intelligence. I think the people that have joined policing now have got way more emotional intelligence than I did when I started. And if Andy Marsh were here, Chief Exec of our college, he would also talk about cultural competence. I regularly still put my foot in it with things that perhaps I shouldn't put my foot in it with. And I think our new recruits are so much more culturally competent than I ever was or could probably hope to be.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Right, that's it, folks. Time is against us. Gavin, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Not just for a really interesting presentation, but also for being prepared to take questions on any topic at all.
Yeah, general policing pub quiz, as I call it.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that people here would agree that you've answered all of those questions as openly and as candidly as you could.
No, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Steve.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
And of course, thank you to you all for attending tonight. So enjoy the rest of the bank holiday weekend. Thank you.
I had to laugh.